We now turn, ladies and gentlemen, to risk, responsibility and Martyn's Law, all you need to know. We're delighted to introduce this session, proudly supported by Howden, one of our key strategic partners. Team 9 works closely with Howden to help businesses better understand Martyn's Law and develop robust plans to mitigate potential threats. Earlier this year, Howden and Team 9 hosted a highly successful webinar that was very well received by our members. We're excited to revisit this important topic and give everyone in the room practical insights and actionable guidance and to strengthen their preparedness. So please give a very warm welcome from Team 9 to Paul Davidson.
Thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Peter, and also thank you very much to Jane and the whole HOSPA team for my first invitation to HOSPACE. It's not lost on me that I'm standing before the hospitality industry about to do a presentation on terrorism. Unless there is the Thomas Pugh Award later on for the most structurally miserable presentation, I fear I'm going home empty-handed. The reality is this, everyone, there's nothing that I can do to make the following presentation cheery. It is not a cheery subject. What I can do is promise that it will be quick, so 15 minutes, and then hopefully, if I'm on time, Peter, a couple of questions at the end. It will be accurate, and at times I'm going to be frank with you as well with what I think as we go through. So no time to waste. Okay, so here we go. Risk, responsibility and Martyn's Law, all you need to know, and introductions to Howden and Team 9. So of course Howden need very little by the way of introduction. They are a sponsor of this event, but as we said, the 5th largest employee-owned business in the UK, which was news to me until I partnered with Howden, market leading in the UK real estate and hospitality industries, and developed the widest possible insurance solution for terrorism and threats in hospitality. I think Team 9, and certainly myself, need a little bit more of an introduction. I think it's incredibly important that if I'm going to stand in front of this sort of audience and talk about something as important as terrorism, then you ought to know what my credibility is to do so. I'm Paul Davidson. I was a former special advisor to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I used to work between Consulate and the Counter-Terrorism Directorate. It was my job before, during and after a terrorist attack to advise ministers and others. That included attending COBRA meetings as required. I'm still a lecturer at Cranfield Defence Academy. Just to keep my hand in, I really enjoy teaching the master students there, and actually it keeps me relevant and up to speed with terrorism issues in the UK. We partner with CT Watch in the US, which is very similar to Team 9. They do a lot of good counter-terrorism work over in the USA. We're vendor neutral. We do not sell anyone else's kit or security equipment, even if we recommend it. And we obviously are members of our own trade bodies as well, so ASIS and the SIA. So I hope that gives you some confidence that we know a bit about what we're talking about in relation to terrorism and counter-terrorism. Okay, Martyn's Law. How have we ended up here? I'm sure many of you will remember that there was a most dreadful terrorist attack at Manchester Arena in 2017 at the Ariana Grande concert. Over 20 people killed, many hundreds of people were seriously injured. The Mayor, Andy Burnham, at the time, being very dynamic, immediately asked Lord Kerslake to conduct an inquiry into that attack, not to find blame, not to point the finger, but to learn the lessons. By most standards, generally agreed to be a very, very thorough report, very reasonable recommendations. But let's just pause there for a minute, because Lord Kerslake didn't ask or recommend within his report that Martyn's Law should be instigated by the UK. The reason we have Martyn's Law is because the diligent and tireless efforts of Figan Murray, Martyn Hett's mother. Martyn Hett lost his life during that attack, and she's lobbied government for many years. The legislation is now with us. In April 2025, it hit the statute books. We're now in a period of grace before the regulator starts looking at requirements. So we have about another year left before the regulator is formed. Hot off the press this week, very senior positions within the SIA have been advertised, ready to instigate Martyn's Law. So it is happening. The law introduces some concepts, and it's really good to understand where you are within these concepts and where you are within the tier levels. So it only applies to premises or events that are open to the public. Therefore, offices are out if it's not open to the public, but of course, the hospitality industry, music events, theatres, cinemas, so on and so forth, are all captured by this legislation. It introduces 2 tiers. So 200 people and above, so there has to be 200 people or above members of the public present for the law to trigger. If you are under that, Martyn's Law does not apply. 800 or above, you're in the enhanced tier. So standard tier, 200 above, 800 above, enhanced tier. Tiers are generally determined by capacity, so that's the amount of people, including staff, quite often gets forgotten, including staff that can be reasonably expected to be present. So, tip number 1, work out what tier you're in. Move on, come on. Enhanced tier. So, this is the 800 and above people present. So, a premises must reasonably expect 800 or more members of the public, including staff, to be present. And an event must reasonably expect 800 people to be present together at the same time. I think it's a really useful phrase that the Lord's put in there, together at the same time. What does that do? It means that if you're having a large music event in Hyde Park and there's 800 people there or more all at once, then it triggers the legislation. However, for all of those, I don't know, small fetes around villages around the country over bank holiday periods that have 200 people on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday and then a Monday, it doesn't trigger the legislation. They have to be together at the same time, and I think that's quite useful. Standard tier. So premises must reasonably expect 200 or more people, including staff, to be present. So very similar, but 200 or more. Therefore, those that are fairly sharp around this stuff and this legislation, generally an event cannot be in the standard tier. So if you're an event, an outdoor event, presentation, what have you, you cannot be in the standard tier. So let's have a look at responsibilities, because there's an awful lot of media and noise out there, frankly, about what the legislation is and those tier levels. It doesn't actually talk an awful lot about the responsibilities. So here is what the legislation requires for the enhanced tier. There must be a responsible person in the business that's designated. That individual's name must be provided to the regulator. They are responsible for Martyn's Law and the Terrorism Protection of Premises Act from that point forward. I have seen some commentary suggesting that that role can be subcontracted. And there are some quite large businesses in London today offering to subcontract that service. They can't, it's not legal. You cannot subcontract it. You can support it with consultants, but you can't subcontract the responsibility. So designated individual for the legislation. Number 2, risk assessments. There has to be an evaluation of the most likely terrorist threats and vulnerabilities at that particular premises. So that needs to be done by somebody that knows something about terrorism so as they can assess that. There needs to be practical measures to reduce risk. So implementing strategies to minimize the terrorism risk at that premises. There needs to be practical measures to reduce harm. I think it's important to just pause there for a minute because that is the bedrock of the legislation. The legislation exists, 1, to reduce terror attacks in the UK, and 2, if there is an attack, to reduce the amount of people that are harmed or killed during it. This is where I'll be frank. I think the first of those objectives, well, I haven't seen any data to suggest that there will be fewer terrorist attacks because of this legislation. However, I do think that if the measures are instigated, then more people, frankly, will survive. Number 5 there, specific training. Targeted training for all relevant workers. So particularly this audience would say, well, what's a relevant worker? The legislation said a relevant worker is anyone who can impact on safety. If they're in a public-facing role, they're a relevant worker, they must be trained. That isn't generically trained, that's trained in the specific plans for that specific premises. Doesn't matter if they're full-time, part-time, or 2 hours behind the bar on a Saturday, they have to be trained in the specific plans for that specific premises. If they move from one premises to another premises, they need to be trained in the plans for that one too. I appreciate that is a pretty tough ask for those in the hospitality industry. Number 6, must implement security measures. They must be reasonable security measures, so that introduces an element of ambiguity of what is reasonable. You must assess access, egress, and monitoring. So there must be monitoring of those coming into the premises and leaving. And the final one there is there must be a security plan and maintenance of that plan, which means that the plan must be reviewed every year. So this is a requirement and a responsibility to be done every year, or sooner if there is a material difference in the premises. There is a lot involved in the enhanced tier. Standard tier responsibilities, there has been some suggestion that this is a much easier path and that there isn't very much to do for the standard tier premises. I don't agree with that. In fact, actually, the two areas are very similar. As you can see, and we'll go through this a little bit more quickly because we've already covered some of it on the previous slide. There must still be a responsible person. There must still be a consideration of the most likely attacks at the venue. There must be measures to reduce attacks. There must be measures to reduce the risk to people. And there must be emergency plans that are drafted and put in place and communication of those plans. There must also be training for every relevant worker, and there must be an annual review. The only real difference between the standard tier and the enhanced tier is there's no requirement on the standard tier, the law says, to introduce actual measures, in other words, invest. Having said that, and this is where I depart slightly from the legislation, it sort of seems reasonable that if you can't introduce any measures to reduce attacks or measures to reduce harm, that you're probably going to have to invest, because saying we're just not doing it doesn't really seem very right. We'll see. Understanding tier exceptions. There are always exceptions. This is complex legislation, but there are exceptions to it. So you've got schools. Generally, schools are not within this legislation. So schools are taken out of the legislation. They will be in the standard tier, not the enhanced tier. So regardless of how many pupils are in the school, they will be in the standard tier. What's the difference to that? Well, unfortunately, colleges and universities are not afforded the same. So colleges and universities are captured by the legislation and will probably all be in the enhanced tier. Places of worship, again, regardless of how many people are at that place of worship, they will be in the standard tier, so they're reduced as well. I think this is quite relevant for this audience. One-off public visitor surges are not captured by the legislation. So, if you are running a standard tier premises, and for some reason, perhaps there's an event next door or in the field opposite or whatever, and suddenly you go from your standard 200 visitors a night to 800, the legislation doesn't trigger. But there's a really important point there. It says one-off. So if this is something that's happening every Saturday, then that's probably not going to get away with it via the regulator. So it's a one-off visitor surge. Standard tier premises can move into the enhanced tier for a one-off issue, which means that they will still need to put in measures that trigger the enhanced tier, but perhaps not as many. So if you only just move into it for a night, then your reasonable security requirements are going to be less than if you are in the enhanced tier for a good portion of the time. And the final one there is generally open public spaces are not triggered by the legislation. So if there's a lot of us walking around a park locally, the legislation is not triggered. Where is it triggered? Well, unfortunately, if you have, anyone do park run? If you're doing park run and there are 800 runners, you're in the enhanced tier. And I'm not sure that was necessarily part of the plan when the legislation was drafted. So if there is a way to count people in and out of an event, then you will be captured by one of the tiers. Challenges for business, and I'm sure many of you have picked up on a good few already. These are the ones that we say. Misinformation, confusion, well-meaning but naive messaging. It is not easy to get to the point of truth around this legislation just now, so I hope that what we've provided so far is useful. For the first time ever, I think, this legislation also puts a responsibility on those running premises captured by it to be responsible for their vicinities, not just for the premises themselves, but for the vicinity around the premises. Now think of that, that's quite challenging, because that could capture a car park or a footpath or what have you. Determining what your vicinity is a really important point. Staff training, which we've mentioned, so we don't need to go over that again. Time, best guess is that Martyn's Law will be in effect. The government currently says very early in 2027, giving 12 months to do all of this stuff and find a budget for all of this stuff. That time will go quickly. Drafting terrorism risk assessments and finding strategic terrorism expertise in the UK is not easy. There is not that much of it, despite what many people on LinkedIn might say. So if you choose an expert, please ask to see their CV. The security industry has a lot of problems as well, and it's an embarrassment to me and many others in it that the industry itself is full of too many poorly qualified or unethical players. The government is trying to do something about that. It has allocated the Institute of Civil Engineers to hold a voluntary register of people that are qualified to deliver this sort of advice. The challenge is there is simply not enough around the UK to do it. The second problem is I said the word voluntary, and unfortunately most of us in the industry would have quite liked to have seen that to be compulsory, but there we have it. Grateful to colleagues and Michael at Howden for giving me this. I'm not the insurance expert, but I'm on a table of quite a few, so I'm just going to read Michael's slide here. The Howden perspective as far as insurance goes is that this creates a new risk landscape. Non-compliance may lead to higher premiums, coverage exclusions, and disputed claims. There could be an increased demand for cover. Martyn's Law impacts on property damage and business interruption. I still don't particularly understand it, Michael, but I know that policies have probably not got sufficient cover within it, as they should. So again, please speak to Michael about that. I do know about directors and officers, and I mentioned about that role of responsible person. I think there's an awful lot of legal weight that sits on the shoulders of somebody in an organisation that's now responsible for terrorism. So what should hotels and the industry do now? Review the terrorism and liability policies, have a look at what staff compliance looks like and what training might look like for you in the future, and consider looking at audits and understanding what tiers you're in. So, that's all the good news out the way. What I can tell you is that Team 9 and Howden have been working with each other for over 18 months on this stuff. We have put an awful lot of thought into trying to put ourselves in your shoes and saying, how can we take as much pain away from you as we can? We're not going to go too far down the line other than to say we've done a lot of thinking around this. But I would just say a quick thank you to the Howden team, because that partnership that we've had with 18 months as a small business with a very large insurer has been excellent, and they've looked after us very well. So thank you, Team Howden. We've got, I think I've timed that not badly. I've got a few minutes.
4 minutes.
Perfect. So questions. If we don't get to your question, I'm sure we'll only have a few. If we don't get to your question, please use that QR code, put your question into us. We will answer it. If it's not here, it will be later on. But we will get back to you and answer your questions, because certainly when we had the webinar with Jane and the rest of the HOSPA team, there were as many questions as there was time to deliver the webinar.
If you don't stop talking.
Sorry, yes, no, sorry. Thank you, Peter.
Hands up if you've got a question for Paul Davidson while he's here. All too scared to reveal your... Oh, Harry. A short question, Harry.
My question is, I'm surprised that schools are not covered when you consider what's happening in America.
Well, I think that's a great question. And likewise, places of worship. We only have to look a few weeks ago to the dreadful attack there. I think that pretty much comes down to local authority budgets and understanding that the Department of Education is going to have to look after them with advice and finance and what have you. So I think there's something to do with that. I can tell you that some of the schools that we're working with, certainly public schools, have said that's great, but we don't have the luxury not to look after this very precious commodity, somebody's children, so we will be operating at the enhanced tier. So there's nothing stopping businesses operating at a higher tier if they wish.
In the absence of hands up, a quick one from me then. In practical terms, what could a place like this do, specifically in practical terms, to protect themselves against the risk of a terrorist catastrophe on the premises? What can we actually do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question too. And I'll say, look, not a week goes by where somebody contacts me and says, hey, under Martyn's Law, you need to put some ballistic glass in, or under Martyn's Law, you need to buy this CCTV system and all the rest of it. And for the vast majority of organisations, you're not going to have to do that investment. That's not what the law requires. The law requires plans, the law requires really good risk management methodology, and the law requires training. So in answer to your question, actually, staff investment, training, and a really good audit and gap analysis. My view is, in somewhere like this, to answer your question, Peter, there is also already an awful lot of good work going on. It might sit under the health and safety portfolio. It might sit under the other parts of the security portfolio. We need to bring it together, say, yes, that is part of a Martyn's Law solution. Now let's look at our gaps. Are they reasonable to fill? So good risk management procedure. And that's probably me done, is it?
One very quick one with a quick answer.
Okay.
This is probably one for everyone to consider. So with the increase in cost, how is the industry going to respond to that?
They're not my budget. I don't envy you. I genuinely don't. Having said that, I'll go back to almost the second from last slide. We've put as much thought into this as we can. We will desperately try. Let's say, we're vendor neutral for a reason. We don't want to be making money off of selling other people's security kit because that means that there is a bias there. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we've set ourselves up, and Howden know this, as a company that want to get people to the minimum standard as possible required to achieve the legislative requirements, the minimum standard, because everything after that is your choice. And actually, most good companies, most good businesses, like the place we're in today, are already doing a lot of good stuff. There will be gaps, but you don't need to invest in many thousands of pounds worth of ballistic glass and rams for vehicles and all of that sort of stuff. That's not going to be required. So can't answer your question directly, but I hope that helps.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Well, I think you've scared the bejesus out of some of us, but thank you very much for that, Paul Davidson.